The billionaire pretended to sleep to test the poor maid's daughter. He never expected what she did next. On a quiet afternoon, late sunlight filtered through the towering windows of the Harrington estate, casting a warm glow across the drawing room. Golden frames caught the light, deep red curtains framed the view, and polished marble floors reflected every detail of the luxurious space. The room breathed wealth and power. And yet, in the center of all that elegance, something jarring disrupted the order. A mountain of cash spread carelessly across the mahogany table. $100 bills, 50s, and 20s lay scattered like autumn leaves, spilling from an open briefcase. The sight felt wrong, almost obscene in its abundance. Resting on the ornate leather sofa behind it was Dr. Gideon Harrington himself, a man whose name commanded boardrooms and whose reputation preceded him like winter frost. His eyes were closed, his tie loosened, his head tilted back against the cushion. But Dr. Harrington wasn't resting. He wasn't sleeping. He was testing. What he was about to witness would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the human heart. Before we move forward, if you genuinely value kindness, second chances, and the strength of compassion, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Linda's Hot Stories. Also, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. What country or city are you watching from? Earlier that day, Dr. Harrington had sat through a particularly bitter board meeting. One of his directors, a man with too much confidence and too little compassion, had made a dismissive comment about people in poverty. How they lacked integrity, how they were always chasing quick money, how desperation erased morality. The words had irritated Dr. Harrington, but they'd also sparked something deeper. A cold curiosity, a need to know if such cynicism had any truth to it. So he devised an experiment. Something dramatic. Something unrealistic but revealing. He would leave a fortune exposed on the table and pretend to fall asleep. If someone took the money, the cynics would be proven right. If they didn't, perhaps there was still goodness left in the world. But Dr. Harrington wasn't testing his staff or his business partners. He wanted to test the one person who'd quietly captured his attention over the past several months. Alice, the small, serious daughter of his maid, Florence Doyle. Alice was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with watchful eyes that carried too much understanding for her age and clothes patched so many times the repairs had become part of the fabric itself. Dr. Harrington had observed her from a distance, noting how she never complained, never asked for anything, and waited silently in corners while her mother worked. She had an innocence that made wealthy men uncomfortable, a living reminder of what privilege had allowed them to forget. Her mother had stepped out to attend to the linens, leaving Alice alone in the drawing room. That's when Dr. Harrington had positioned himself on the sofa, loosened his tie, let his head fall back, and closed his eyes just enough. He didn't know what to expect. Perhaps the girl would flee. Perhaps she would cry. Or perhaps she would take the money. Not from greed, but from the kind of desperation that strips away choice. What he didn't expect was the silence that followed. Alice saw the money immediately. Her eyes went wide, but not with hunger. With fear. She stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate, as though approaching something forbidden. Her small hand reached out, trembling, and her fingers brushed the edge of one bill. She hesitated, and her hand hovered in the air as if the money itself might burn her skin. Dr. Harrington, eyes barely open, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He could sense her struggle as clearly as if it were his own, the tension radiating from her like heat from stone. She was thinking, contemplating, wrestling with something far heavier than a child should carry. The sunlight caught her face, revealing soft features marred by dirt smudges from playing outside, revealing a weariness that aged her beyond her years. He heard the faint sound of her breathing catch, a small noise that nearly broke his composure. Then she reached down and picked up a single bill, a crisp $100 note. Her fingers closed around it, and for a heartbeat, Dr. Harrington's breath stopped. This was it. This was where she would fail, where the cynics would win. But then Alice did something he never imagined. She pressed the bill flat against the table again, smoothing the edges with delicate, careful movements, as if returning it to perfect condition might undo the temptation she'd felt. She swallowed hard and whispered something so quietly he couldn't make out the words. But he felt their weight settle into the room like snow. Alice stood frozen, staring at the money. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. And then, slowly, she reached not for the bills but for something at the nape of her neck, a small worn ribbon that held her hair in place. She pulled it free gently, as if it were precious, and placed it atop the pile of cash. Like an offering. Like a trade. Like a symbol of something Dr. Harrington's wealth could never buy. Her small voice trembled as she spoke to the money as though it could hear her. She whispered that she would never steal. That her mother, Florence, had taught her that honesty was the only thing they owned that no one could take away. That whoever the money belonged to would find her ribbon and know she'd tried her best. She wished she could help her mother, buy medicine, buy shoes, buy a warm blanket, but not with stolen money. Never with stolen money. Dr. Gideon Harrington felt a sting behind his closed eyelids, the kind of sting a man like him hadn't felt since he was a boy. He wanted to sit up to speak, but he forced himself to remain still, needing to hear every word, needing to bear witness to this moment of pure, devastating integrity. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. After placing her ribbon, Alice stepped back. Her shoulders curled inward, protecting something fragile inside her chest. She whispered once more, this time more firmly, as if convincing herself, telling herself she was strong enough to walk away. Dr. Harrington's mind drifted back to the board meeting that morning, replaying the moment that had planted this entire test in his consciousness. Director Pemberton had been complaining again, his voice dripping with disdain as he gestured dismissively with his expensive pen. People in poverty have no moral compass, he declared with absolute certainty. They're all chasing quick money, looking for any opportunity to take what isn't theirs. It's simply their nature. The words had struck Dr. Harrington like a slap, not because they shocked him, but because he realized he'd been nodding along, accepting such statements without question for years. Had wealth made him so detached that he'd stopped seeing people as individuals? Or was Pemberton right? The question gnawed at him throughout the afternoon until an idea crystallized. Dramatic, perhaps theatrical, but undeniably revealing. He would stage a test so obvious, so tempting that it would expose the truth. A fortune left unguarded. A man apparently asleep. An opportunity any naturally dishonest person would seize. And he knew exactly who would be his subject. Alice, Florence Doyle's quiet daughter with the patched clothes and watchful eyes. If poverty truly corrupted integrity, this child, desperate, vulnerable, invisible, would prove it beyond doubt. Alice entered the drawing room holding her mother's hand, her footsteps barely audible on the polished marble. Florence Doyle paused at the threshold, her weathered face stern but softened by maternal concern. She bent down, meeting her daughter's eyes with quiet intensity. "Remember the rules, Alice," Florence whispered firmly. "Don't touch anything. Wait quietly. Hands folded. Do you understand?" Alice nodded solemnly, her small fingers clasping together obediently. "Good girl," Florence said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead before straightening. "I'll only be here for a few minutes. The linens need washing." The moment Florence's footsteps faded down the corridor, Dr. Harrington moved into position. He settled onto the leather sofa, loosened his silk tie, and let his head tilt back against the cushion. He forced his breathing to slow, his body to relax into false sleep, though every nerve remained alert. What would she do? His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps she'd grab the money and run, desperation overcoming caution. Perhaps she'd flee the room in terror, understanding the trap instinctively. Or perhaps she'd simply stand there and cry, paralyzed by temptation she couldn't reconcile with the values her mother had instilled. He waited, barely breathing, for the answer. The silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Alice stood perfectly still, her hands folded as instructed, listening to the distant sounds of the estate, muffled voices, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind against windows. The realization dawned slowly. She was truly alone. Her gaze drifted across the familiar room, taking in the golden frames and deep curtains, and then stopped. The money. Mountains of it, spread across the mahogany table like something from a dream or a nightmare. Her eyes went wide, her mouth forming a small O of shock. This wasn't curiosity or desire that crossed her face. It was pure, visceral fear. She took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by something she couldn't name. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, as though approaching a sleeping animal that might wake and strike. Her hand reached out slowly, trembling in the afternoon light. Through the narrow slits of his barely open eyes, Dr. Harrington watched her small fingers hover over the edge of the bills. They hung there, suspended in indecision, casting tiny shadows across the currency. His heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to remain motionless, waiting to see which direction her conscience would turn. Alice's fingers brushed the edge of a bill, and her mind flooded with images she tried desperately to suppress. Medicine for her mother's cough that kept them both awake at night. New shoes to replace the ones held together with string and hope. A warm blanket so they wouldn't huddle together shivering through winter evenings. The money smelled clean, like fresh cotton, like possibility itself. This pile of paper could transform everything. Could lift them from the grinding poverty that made every day a struggle for dignity. Her chest tightened with a want so powerful it hurt. Dr. Harrington felt her conflict as tangibly as heat radiating from a fire. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, pressing against his skin, making him acutely aware of every shallow breath she took. Through his barely open eyes, he studied her face, the dirt smudges on her cheek, the way her brow furrowed with concentration, and most striking of all, the weary seriousness in those young eyes. Eyes that had seen too much hardship, carried too much responsibility, understood too clearly what this money represented. She wasn't a child contemplating theft. She was a soldier standing at the edge of a battlefield, weighing survival against honor, knowing that whatever choice she made would define her forever. Alice's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching past hesitation and fear. Her fingers closed around a single bill, a crisp $100 note that felt impossibly smooth against her rough, work-worn skin. She lifted it slowly from the pile, holding it up to the light as if examining its reality. Dr. Harrington's breath caught in his throat. His chest constricted with something uncomfortably close to disappointment. This was it then. The test was over. Pemberton had been right all along. Poverty did corrode integrity. Desperation did override conscience. The girl would take the money, and he would have his answer, bitter as it was. But then something extraordinary happened. Alice's fingers tightened around the bill for just a heartbeat, a moment of fierce, desperate longing, and then released. The tension drained from her small hand as if someone had cut invisible strings. She let the $100 note fall back onto the pile, watching it flutter down like a leaf returning to earth. Dr. Harrington's heart hammered so loudly he feared she might hear it. He forced himself to remain still, to keep breathing steadily, even as every instinct screamed at him to sit up and understand what he'd just witnessed. Alice leaned over the table with careful deliberation, her small hands smoothing the $100 bill she'd nearly taken. She pressed it flat, running her fingers along the edges with meticulous attention, as if perfecting its placement could somehow erase the temptation that had nearly consumed her. Her lips moved in a whisper so soft Dr. Harrington could barely hear. "No, I won't. I can't." Then she reached up to the back of her head, her fingers finding the small worn ribbon that held her hair in place. The only pretty thing she owned, faded pink and frayed at the edges. She pulled it free gently, reverently, and her hair fell around her shoulders in tangled waves. For a long moment, she held the ribbon in her palm, staring at it as if saying goodbye to something precious. She placed it atop the pile of money with trembling hands. "Mama said honesty is the only thing we own that no one can take away," she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking with emotion. "So I'm leaving this. So you'll know I was here. So you'll know I tried my best not to take what wasn't mine." The ribbon lay there like a flag of surrender, or perhaps of victory. Dr. Harrington felt a sting behind his closed eyelids, Sharp, unexpected, almost painful. It was an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades. Not since childhood, when the world still had the power to wound and heal in equal measure. His carefully constructed walls, built brick by brick through years of business dealings and calculated detachment, cracked under the weight of what he'd just witnessed. Alice stepped back from the table, her small shoulders curling inward as if protecting something fragile within her chest. She walked slowly to the window seat, moving like someone carrying an invisible burden, and sat down with her hands folded in her lap exactly as her mother had instructed. Her head bowed slightly, and she stared at her patched dress as if seeking comfort in its familiarity. Dr. Harrington couldn't maintain the pretense any longer. The ruse felt suddenly obscene, a violation of something sacred. He opened his eyes fully, blinking against the afternoon light, and looked at the small figure by the window. This child who had just taught him more about human dignity than a lifetime of wealth and power ever could. The truth he'd been seeking had been there all along, waiting to shatter his cynicism completely. Dr. Harrington rose from the sofa slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He walked to the mahogany table, his eyes passing over the scattered bills without interest, without recognition of their value. They were just paper now, meaningless. His fingers reached for the small, faded ribbon lying atop the pile, worn soft from years of use, the pink color bleached nearly white in places. He lifted it gently, holding it in his palm as if it were made of glass. This simple ribbon, worth nothing in monetary terms, was the most valuable thing anyone had ever left him. It represented something his billions could never buy. Pure, uncorrupted integrity born from genuine sacrifice. He turned toward the window, toward the small figure sitting so still and proper in the fading light. As he looked at Alice, this child who'd chosen honor over survival, something fundamental shifted inside him. The coldness that had defined him for so long began to thaw, like winter giving way to spring after an endless frost. The test, the money, his carefully constructed cynicism, Pemberton's cruel assumptions, all of it crumbled into insignificance. He'd been asking the wrong questions his entire life, measuring worth by the wrong standards. Dr. Harrington approached the window slowly, the ribbon still cradled in his palm. Alice's head snapped up at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes going wide with terror. She stood quickly, her hands clasping together, her whole body trembling as she prepared for punishment she was certain would come. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't take anything, I promise." "Alice," Dr. Harrington said gently, and to her shock, he lowered himself to one knee before her, bringing his eyes level with hers. He held out the ribbon. "This belongs to you." Her confusion was evident as she stared at the offering, then at his face. "You've taught me something today," he continued, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite control. "Something more valuable than anything I learned in 40 years of business. You showed me that integrity isn't bought or sold, it's carried in the heart." He pressed the ribbon into her small hand and closed her fingers around it. "Kindness like yours deserves the world, Alice. And I promise you," his voice grew firm with conviction, "your life and your mother's life will never be the same again." Alice's terror slowly transformed into something fragile and unfamiliar. Hope. If this story resonated with you, we'd be grateful if you take a moment to like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Linda's Hot Stories. Your engagement allows us to continue sharing meaningful stories that inspire. Before you leave, we'd love to hear from you. What choice would you have made if you were in Alice's position?